Thank you to everyone who's filtering in right now. Today is focusing all on interviews, whether it be remote, whether it be in person. And we're super excited to have folks from Wolf and Company here to help guide us through all of it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to them. I'll let them take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Carly. Hi, everybody. We'll take a moment to introduce ourselves. My name is Colleen Simonelli. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I'm the Chief People Officer at Wolf and Company. If you haven't heard of us, I'll give you a little bit of background in a minute. Some of you might have seen me when I worked at PTC. We were involved there with helping to form one of the first sponsors of the Chamber of Commerce. And I'm also on the board for PIOW, Pride in Our Workplace. We're excited to be here today and to talk about interviewing, because it's a unique time that if you're looking for a job, but you know, interviewing is happening. People are hiring, so we want to do everything we can to help you. I'll turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Gary, to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining today. I'm Gary LaFond. I use the pronouns he, him, and his. If you can see me in your video today, that is 99 High Street in Boston. That's our home office. And for the past few months, most of us have not been there. We're eagerly looking forward to getting back there so we can meet people in person as well as do these video calls. But thanks for joining today. I'm the Director of Human Resources at Wolf, so I oversee a lot of the people functions and have been at the firm my entire career, dating back to 1986. So yeah, so welcome. So I'm going to hand it over now to Dana Sakos. Dana is our recruiting manager for Wolf.
Thank you, Gary. Again, hi, my name is Dana Sakos. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. I am our recruiting manager here at Wolf, and I've been with the firm for about 2 years. And, you know, I think that this has been the most interesting time for me. I'm also learning how to interview on Zoom. So hopefully some of our tips and tricks will help you as well. So I will hand it back to Colleen to speak a little bit about the firm first. And I will start our webinar.
Great, thank you, Dana. So just a little bit of background on who Wolf and Company is, if you want to move the slide. So Wolf is, as Gary said, based in Boston. The firm is over 100 years old, formed in 1911. We have about 275 employees, and you'll see we have 4 offices, Boston being the biggest, as well as Springfield. And the firm is an audit, tax, risk management, and business consulting firm. And just a little bit more background. We're a member of Lineal Global. That's a renowned organization of global accounting and consulting firms. We're also registered with the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. And then, you know, we're very excited and proud that we were just named top 100 accounting firms from Boston Business Journal. So I had not heard of Wolf before joining, and I've learned it's one of the best kept secrets. If you haven't heard of them and if you're interested in a career in this type of firm, we are doing some hiring. And our niche focus is we focus on financial institutions, a lot of banking, the healthcare industry, investment management, manufacturing, distribution, retail, private client groups, technology, and then we have a product called Wolfpack Integrated Risk Management. So I do find it's a great place to work. I've been here for 2 months, and I'm excited that we're able to connect Wolf with the Chamber to help you all and talk about interviewing. So Dana, I'll turn it back to you to share your wisdom.
My wisdom. We'll see about that. Okay, so again, thank you so much. Thank you, Colleen, for your great introduction. And thank you all for having us here today. I'd like to start off by saying interview is nerve-wracking. I mean, whether it's in person or it's virtual, I don't think that I've come across a candidate who hasn't been at least a little bit nervous. So it's completely natural. So what we've done is we compiled some down into three sections: pre-interview, interview, during the interview, and post-interview. So I will begin with our pre-interview section. So the first tip that I have for you is to download and become familiar with the platform. So if you aren't familiar with the platform you're using, it's probably best not to wait until right before your job interview to download it and test it out. Whether it's Zoom or Skype, each app has its own personality, has its own quirks that you need to become familiar with. For example, Zoom is a cloud-based video interview platform. It's a software app, actually. While Skype, you have to download beforehand. I've learned from experience that with Skype, there's a few extra steps, such as downloading a plugin that could take a few minutes, or seeing if your computer is compatible with. So kind of really making time for that beforehand is really, really important. So the second tip I have is testing your technology. So as soon as you agree to a virtual interview, test your technology to ensure it's working properly. And sometimes there are things that are out of your control, such as today, my video and my audio aren't the strongest, and it's hard, but you need to try to ensure that it's working properly. Check your internet connectivity if you can, to confirm your camera and your audio are working properly. If the picture is a little bit grainy or you're experiencing some sort of an echo, you might need some time to test that out and do a little trial and error. So it's important to give yourself, plenty of time to figure that out. And this is just before the interview. As soon as you know, the day of the interview, I would also test your equipment and internet connection once more. For example, I use a webcam. One time last week, I was trying to join a Zoom meeting with members of Wolf & Company, and the camera just wouldn't turn on. I have no idea why. It just wouldn't turn on, which I had to restart my computer. It took an extra 15 minutes, and I was running the meeting. So it's always good to be prepared time-wise for the impossible. I think our third pre-interview tip would be to set the scene. While you're testing your technology, determine where you want to take that interview. Some of us are able to have private rooms. Some of us are working from our kitchen table, or in your bedroom. I would find a room with optimal lighting, so you're not in the dark, preferably near a window. Also look towards a blank wall to have your background so that you're guaranteed to be the focal point of the presentation. Everyone wants to see your shining face, so that is where they should be focused. So, whether you are sitting on your living room couch or in your home office, make sure your surroundings are tidy. You wouldn't think that, but sometimes you can see a lot outside your camera. And it's a little bit hard to convince your, maybe future employer that you are well organized when you have a pile of laundry sitting behind you. So, in that sense, once you are settled, the second part of this tip is to eliminate all distractions as much as you can. Obviously, some of us have kids, some of us have pets that like to play with us, but to the point that you can, try to eliminate them. Turn off your TV, silence your cell phone, close any nearby windows. Unless you don't have AC, then I would say probably don't do that. Be comfortable. But make sure you are in a quiet and comfortable place. So our next one is use a virtual background if you're using Zoom, if you do need it. One of the unique features that Zoom has are virtual backgrounds. If the location that you're using is too distracting, so if you have a ton of posters on the wall or some pictures that might take away your face and the focal point, consider using one of Zoom's backgrounds. They have I think 4 or 5 that are included. Also, make sure to practice to see if it works correctly. Colleen and I were both, talking about that right before this to make sure that our backgrounds were correct. Because, for example, one time I did put a wolf background on, not knowing that it was flipped. It looked fine to me, but to everyone else, it was, backwards, and everyone it was an internal meeting, but everyone liked to make a few wisecracks about it. If you do download your own background, just try to make sure that it's not distracting or flashy or unprofessional. I use these two pictures to show, the first one, which is one of the included ones with Zoom, and the second, which is, while you think is funny, it could be distracting and a little bit unprofessional when you're interviewing for a role. You want to make sure, obviously, your background isn't taking away from you, which, again, I know I keep speaking about, but you are the focal point of this interview. Also, if you are going to use a background, make sure that you populate it beforehand. You don't want to go into an interview that has messy stuff and say to them, oh, hold on 1 second, let me put up, my background. It just looks a lot professional just going straight in and having, no distractions. Great. Okay, so a little bit more. Using a professional profile name. You do want to be sure, and for those who don't know, and maybe this is the first time you're using Zoom, on the bottom left, as you can see from Gary, Colleen, and myself, that is your professional name, and you're able to change that by clicking the 3 little dots and putting in what you would like. But you do want to make sure it's professional. Obviously the simplest thing is to use your full name as your profile name. Remember one thing though, the last name that you use is the one that will populate. So if you do use Zoom or Skype for personal reasons, as in this pandemic, I Zoom with my best friends once a week. The name that you have put up there is the last one that is going to be automatically put up. So one example of this is my last name is Sakos. My roommates from college call me Dana Taco because I love tacos. I absolutely love them. They're my favorite food. And so when I Zoom with them, I put up the name Taco. And I learned the hard way that one day that it automatically populates, and no one really understood why my name was Taco on my professional meeting. So hopefully, with that tip, you won't make the same mistake that I did. So that is a big one for me. The second is to close programs on your computer. Now, this one is a really easy one to forget. I actually did it probably a minute before we came on. You want to close down all of the other programs that your computer is running that will take some of the juice and some of the internet speed away from what you're doing. You want to avoid the slowdown of your operating system. And you also don't want alerts or pop-ups coming up. Sometimes you think that, the other person across from you virtually can't hear them, but you actually can. And sometimes they're really distracting if, people are constantly IMing you, or, your next meeting is coming up or whatnot. So it's something it's a small tip, but it's something that does go a long way. So our next one is to sit down prepared. I mean, this is a pretty straightforward one, but it's something I do like to focus on because I really appreciate when candidates are focused and, ready to go and are really prepared. This sometimes goes without saying, but I like to say it anyways, to research the company ahead of time and jot down notes, stick them to your computer for easy reference. It's actually kind of alarming sometimes that I speak to candidates and I ask what they know about us, and sometimes they don't know anything. And so it kind of, it does make a standout in your mind when a candidate does know exactly what's going on. I would also print, even though it's virtual, and obviously this is in person as well, I would print out a copy of your resume, sometimes highlight it, have it in front of you. So that you can talk to key talking points and some of the accolades that you have. One of the big things with being prepared is to double check, triple check, maybe quadruple check the date, the time, and the time zone of your Zoom interview. The last thing you want to do is miss your interview because of a time zone mix-up. So my advice is to check the email from the employer the day of, maybe an hour before. Make sure it's on your calendar at the right time. It is a simple step, but it will avoid a lot of potential embarrassment and hassle. It did happen to a candidate that I had who was meeting with two partners at our firm. And, you know, he was in a different time zone, and we did send the confirmation email, and we did send the invite in our time zone, and we did let him know, but for some reason it went on his calendar wrong. And it was kind of a little bit of an inconvenience for both parties to reschedule and whatnot. You know, we did end up bringing him on, so it wasn't that bad, but it was a problem at the time. And it's something that, you know, just a little bit of checking and double checking you could avoid. So the last one on this slide is to dress the part. And obviously my two lovely pictures here are two opposites on what we call. So you might be sitting, like I said before, near on your bed, but that shouldn't look like you just rolled out of it. Dress as you would for an in-person interview. I don't think that a Zoom interview should be any different. It is still an interview. For men, that, you know, depending on where you're interviewing and what's appropriate, could be a button-up shirt, a blazer. You know, for women, could be anything you're comfortable in that, you know, is appropriate for where you're interviewing. While tempting, I would avoid the half-person dressing, which is kind of the picture that I have here, where, you know, you're professional up top, but party down in the bottom. You know, there was a story, and I'm not sure if any of you have heard about the newscaster who went on air, I think maybe only in his boxers or whatnot. I didn't know that everyone could see him, but the whole country ended up, and I think that he's had some embarrassment over it, but, you know, it does happen. So I would try to, you know, dress for the part fully. So our next section, I'll start off by this first slide, and then I'll hand it over to Gary. But the first part is, you know, of the actual sitting down interview process is to come prepared with questions. You know, I try to talk a lot about Wolf in my interviews and my phone screens, and sometimes I answer questions that, you know, you may have had, but that's why it's really great to have 10 or 15 questions that maybe something I didn't cover, or something that you could ask me to play off of or elaborate more on. Like I had mentioned earlier, researching the company ahead of time and jotting down notes for your references is probably always the best bet. But you should always be prepared to answer the question, do you have any questions for me? So I'm going to put up a few common interview questions that you might want to ask an employer. Obviously, each person is different, and what you're kind of looking for will tailor these questions, but they're pretty broad, and I'm asked them quite often. So the first is, what does a typical day in the life of this role look like? I'm asked this quite a bit, as Wolf & Company has 3 different lines of service departments, as well as an administrative side. So sometimes I respond with, that might be a better question suited for this person, but I do, to the best of my ability, like to answer this question on, what are some of the great things you'll see, what challenges might you have, but a lot of deeper questions can evolve from this first broad question. The second question that comes up a lot was, what does this company's culture look like? Because I think that's probably, at least for me, it's one of the most important questions. A company is only good as its people. And, we, at least at Wolf, we really strive to have a great company culture, and I'm very proud of it. Obviously, as Colleen said, we had just won the BBJ's Best Place to Work, and I was so jazzed when I heard about that, just because it does have a really good reflection of our culture. But it is, it's good to see, what your employer, what it might look like for you to work there in the future and be a part of that culture. All right, the third that I hear a lot, and it's very great to be prepared with, what resources does your company provide for its employees? Do they have employee resource groups? Do they have, activities group? Anything that you can become that's inclusive, ask. Sometimes it's not on their website or they're not advertising it, but asking that and really trying to get a straight, deep answer is very beneficial. The fourth, how would you describe the ideal candidate for a position? I hear this a lot, or how does a candidate succeed in this position, or what are the best attributes? It really makes your interviewer dig deep on what they're really looking for, and it's a good jump off for yourself and for them to see if you're a great fit for the role. And sometimes you're not. Sometimes they're looking for someone that might not, fit kind of what you're looking for, and that's me too. But it's good to know. So the fifth, where does this role sit in the organization, and what other groups will I be working with? So, where does this role play in? At Wolf, in a lot of accounting firms, we have leveling as you progress through your career. So knowing who you're going to work with, is it cross-functional? Am I going to work with other groups of the firm? What am I doing? I think it'll be a great overall bubble on what you are, what the role it will entail. And then this is what I hear a lot. Can you walk me the next steps through the hiring process? I try to end every interview that I have with letting candidates know what's going on. What do you expect next? When will I next be in touch? But some interviewers don't, and sometimes we'll get off your interview and be like, well, what's next? So it's having that power and asking, tell me, what's next? What can I expect? I appreciate that. Hopefully others do. So for the next slide, I will hand it over to Gary LaFond.
Thank you very much, Dana. Excellent job. Those are excellent questions. I think it's important to remember that you're not only being interviewed, you are interviewing the interviewer, right? So you're trying to find out if this is the job, the place you want to end up, right? So it's contingent on you to ask those good questions to get that answer for yourself, right? Because interviews are a two-way street. So the other side of the street is when you are asked questions. So I'm going to go through some typical questions that you should be prepared to answer in a typical interview session, whether that's in person or virtual, right? And number one, guidance here is to be yourself, to be authentic, right? To be genuine. You don't want to over-rehearse, because what happens when you over-rehearse is you become too robotic. And sometimes you start to answer the question before the interviewer actually spits out the question, which can be, make for an uncomfortable situation. So you want to be prepared at a high level so that when you do get the question, it spurs your thought and you can be genuine and actually respond to the question being asked, right? If you're over-rehearsed, you might go a different way with your answer. So some questions that you'll probably get interviewing for most positions in most organizations are, number one, why are you interested in this role in this company? Think about that and answer it. Be genuine. I'll take any job is probably being too genuine, but cite the reasons, go to the website, do the research, and be authentic and say, this is why I want to be there, right? So that's a question you're likely to get. The second thing, again, on research, second question here, what do you know about our company? Our expectation when you walk into the room or the virtual room for an interview is that you've done your research and you know what we do. And the interview is for you to gain more information to see if it's suitable directly for you, and for us to obviously see if you're suitable for us. But you do that by going to the website, seeing if you know, going on LinkedIn, seeing if you know anyone that you're connected to that works at Wolf, that you can get some more information, more research on the role, on the company, to see if it's a place that you want to be. The next question you're likely to hear are to talk about development areas, right? So some recruiters refer to them as weaknesses. I like to look at them as areas for development, but we all have them, right? Some people are, too succinct sometimes. Some people look at the big picture too much, but there's always something that, with some thinking, some thought, you can turn what the recruiter might look as a weakness into something positive. So think about that answer before you answer it, right? Number 4, what do you consider to be your biggest professional achievement? If you're early in your career, this may be a difficult question to answer, but you can always go back to your college days, maybe leading a group of friends in a sport or an organization, in a leadership role. Those are great answers to questions. So think about that one before you walk into the room. Number 5, tell me about a challenge at work and how you dealt with it. Very important here to not only discuss the challenge, but to talk about how you handled it. The employer is looking for how you handled it, whether you elevated it correctly, et cetera, right? So you want to think that through before you walk into the room, because you'll likely be asked about barriers. Life isn't a straight line. There are curves in the road all the time. And as an interviewer, we're trying to figure out what you do when you come up on an obstacle. Do you retreat? Do you find your way around? So think that through. Think of your life experiences specific to a job, if they ask you specific to a job, but expect to be asked that. Okay, next. What are you looking for in a new position? That will often be asked. We're trying to align the needs of our company with your needs, right? So we want to make sure that those are aligned before we hire you. And what are you looking for? Why are you looking for a new opportunity? Sometimes people will have multiple careers within their lifetime, and sometimes they have good reasons. Other times, maybe not so good reasons, right? So you want to have an answer when you move from one company to another, or change careers, or direction in your professional life, right? So think about that before you walk in the room, and it'll make that discussion much better. And where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 years? Tough question in the age of COVID, I think, to say where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 months could be difficult. But what we're looking for here is, increase in responsibility is an important thing to think about, and just to kind of think about career-wise what you want, because generally we hire people for the long run, for hopefully a stepped career at Wolf & Company, and we're not looking for someone that's just coming in to get 6 months of experience and move on. So think about your answer to that question before you walk into the room. All right, next slide, Dana.
There's a belly.
All right. So body language in the interview room. Okay, so in person, there's a lot of nonverbal communication. We're trying to replicate that by using video with Zoom, with Skype. But it's very important to practice talking slowly, practice talking clearly, and to make sure that you're paying attention and looking into the eyes of the interviewer. With Zoom and Skype, this is difficult because we're taught to look into the camera, but then if you're looking into the camera and not at your interviewer, you can't pick up on their nonverbal cues. So kind of a difficult area, but things to think about: don't play with your hair, The touching of the face. Since COVID came out, everyone realizes they touch their face way too much, right? You got to be cognizant of that when you're on an interview. Hands down. Doing my best here to keep mine down. So yeah, just kind of pay attention to your body and to what you're doing, as if you were sitting across from someone across from a desk, right? Okay, and I talked a little bit about the next point. Speak slowly, speak clearly. Practice. Pauses are great to allow the person that you're talking to actually think about the thought that you just spat out. Very productive going both ways in an interview. Next point is, don't be afraid to ask for clarification. If you don't understand a question, don't just try to answer it based on what you think they might have said. Ask for clarification. This can be very important because you might answer something the wrong way because you heard it wrong and are afraid to ask for clarification. Definitely, especially with Zoom, you're going to have cutouts and connection difficulties from time to time, no matter what you do. So, we urge you to ask if you didn't hear something correctly. And then finally, be yourself. I think I started with that. Be genuine. We're going to try to assess if you're a good fit for our company. This can be tough if there's no disconnect, if there's no connection. Enthusiasm. It's much easier to kind of present that in person because of that nonverbal. So do your best when you're answering your questions to be genuine, to be yourself, and you'll be successful in your interview.
So Gary and Dana, we have a few questions that have come in. Would you like to keep going, or would you like to pause and answer some questions?
I have one more slide with 2 items. So why don't we get through those, and then
That sounds great.
Okay. So the interview wraps up. What should you do? So you say your goodbyes, you say thank you, of course, right? And then our recommendation is within 24 hours, send an individual email to each person that you talk to. So if it was just one person, you'll send one email. It'll show you value of the interviewer's time, the time of the organization, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of double down on the strengths you might bring to the role, or anything that, I'm sure when people walk out of an interview room and they're on their way down the elevator, they say, oh, I should have asked him that. So this is your opportunity in that follow-up letter or follow-up email to kind of ask that question. This will keep, the interviewer will get the email and you'll be top of mind. If you don't send that email, it's going to be less of a connection. And then finally, the communication. Sometimes you'll have to wait a while. You may be the first person that we interview for a job. And our intention is, to look at 20 candidates. If you're candidate number 1, you're gonna wait a lot longer for a decision than candidate 20. Don't be afraid to reach out to see what our timeline is and to get an update on where you're at. Now, we don't want to hear from you every day, but we do want to hear from you because that just shows us another level of interest. All right. So that gets us through the slides. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we have 5 questions in the queue. I'll just read through them and then whoever would like to answer it. So the first one is, what are bad questions to bring to an interview?
Oh, I can start off with that. And I wouldn't necessarily call them bad, or at least the ones that I'm thinking in my head. But, one question that kind of turns me off a bit is, asking about salary, like right off the bat. What does this pay? What does the position pay? I'm usually transparent with all candidates about, what we're thinking compensation-wise. And I have that conversation immediately. And, I try to ask, what are you thinking? Where do you want to be? but I would try to leave it maybe to the recruiter to start talking about salary, or at least maybe not start off with that as your first question, or, what does it pay? Or, how much time off do I get? Some of the questions, it will eventually come out organically. And I don't think that is the best impression to start off with asking those.
Yeah, I can share here as well, if you don't mind. So I've been in a few interviews in my career that I've talked about a subject, right? And then 5 minutes later, the candidate asks the same question. So repetitive questions resulting from not really listening to the interviewer are not good questions.
Really good points. Thank you. So the next question. Oh, sorry. Let me just go back to it. All right. Can you give some examples of the type of challenges that would be good to discuss in response to the interview question about handling a challenge? People might mean a lot of different things by challenge.
I can start off by speaking about an experience that I had. So sometimes I phrase that question a little bit differently with candidates. I say, tell me about a time you failed, and how did you, how did you fix it, or what was the outcome? Which is a little bit kind of probably what we meant by, a challenge that you had. And so I like to tell an example about how once I sent a rejection email to every single person in our applicant tracking system instead of just one person. So candidates who we had accepted or hadn't started yet, everyone got rejected. And what I did immediately was, pretty much called every single person in that applicant tracking system. I let my boss and supervisor know what was going on, so we were all aware to be able to handle it and minimize the damage. But what I learned from that is, to don't press check all on any boxes, but I also like to do some processes a lot slower and look at them. So that is the type of question that I'm looking for in that type of kind of example when I do ask that type of question.
Yeah, I can add that I think a good example is how you deal with conflicting priorities. In professional life, you will have multiple things that people are telling you need to have done at the same time, right? And your ability to manage the processes and, most importantly, the communication around your solution is what we're looking to hear, and how you managed around to make sure that people were communicated to, as well as the work either being done or being done one thing at a time.
That's a great point. And I would just add too, knowing the job that you're interviewing for, think about what are the types of challenges you might have in that job, and then try to think of an experience that you've had so it can be very relevant to the job. Okay, thank you. So the next question, are there any specific questions you can ask in an interview to help find out if folks are LGBT friendly? And actually, Grace Moreno, who is here, would like to answer this question live. I'm not sure if she joins or if she types it in. I think she types it in. While she's doing that, and Grace, I'm really glad you're here. I wish I could see you. But I'll add a few thoughts that I have. I would ask them, do they have an inclusion and diversity strategy? Does the company have a strategy? Do they have a department that focuses on inclusion and diversity? Dana already said to ask about their culture. What's the company culture like? Do they have employee resource groups? Or do they have like a diversity committee? Look at their website. How do they present themselves? I would look on LinkedIn. Do you know anybody that works there or knows somebody else that works there? So you can get some information. I think Dana mentioned that as well. Do they use pronouns in their emails? Do they have inclusive benefits? There's so much information that is public now too. So I'd go on LinkedIn, I'd go on Glassdoor and see what are people saying. You could also go to the Human Rights Campaign website and see, are they on the CEI index, the Corporate Equality Index? So there's a lot of good public information that you can you can obtain? Are they sponsoring LGBT programs and organizations? Gary, Dana, anything you'd like to add to that? And I know Grace will be adding to it as well.
You're spot on. I would do.
That was pretty comprehensive. Good answer.
Yeah, I mean, I'm asked that a lot. Can you talk to me about, Wolf's stance on diversity? Like, it's pretty, you could be direct and ask, and, I'm happy to talk about it. So, spot on.
That's great. Okay, moving on. Next question. What if I get asked about my identity in the interview? Oops, just moved. What if I get asked my identity in the interview and am uncomfortable answering? Is there a right way to react to intrusive questions to help the interview move along? So I'd like to take that too, because first of all, that's not an appropriate question. But I mean, sometimes interviewers ask inappropriate questions. So what do you do? Because this might be a job that you really want, and the organization, it just might be a problem with the interviewer. I would redirect them. You don't need to answer that, but you don't want to, you want to try and manage it the best you can. So, let's say they asked me about my identity. I'd say, well, I'm Colleen and I'm here for the interview and I'm really excited to be here. So I'd really like to talk about the job and my qualifications for it. And see, you could do it just in that way. Hopefully that wouldn't offend the person, but it redirects them back to the purpose of why you're there. And Gary, Dana, anything that you want to add to that in your experience?
I know it's hard, but I would take exactly what you said. Try to stay composed, even though probably inside you're like, why are you asking me this? But, like Colleen said, redirect in kind of a composed and calm way, and let them, try to pivot.
Yeah, I agree. Maintain your emotions and try to get through that and to move them along.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Are interviewers understanding if I don't have an ideal room to video chat from? For example, I live in an apartment and don't have a desk in my room, so I have to take calls either from my bed or from the living room. Will it be a problem if my roommates or pet have to walk by in the background? That's a great question.
I have this one. I'm in my bedroom right now.
Me too.
Enough said.
I'll say,
yeah.
And I'll let you continue, Gary. If you have, or sorry, I didn't want to cut you off if you had more to add.
So I think, COVID has kind of pushed along some more allowance for such things. Family sitting on your lap, your cat crawling over you, the dog barking in the background. Maybe pre-COVID these things were no-nos, but I think people, at least in our organization, have been really flexible with these things and realize it's part of remote life.
Yeah, definitely. I had a candidate last week whose dog walked by, and I looked and I was like, "Is that a golden doodle?" And they're like, "Yeah." And I was like, I picked up mine and we put them both on our laps, and we, continued our conversation with our golden doodles on our laps. So it's not. We definitely understand. I think to the point that I made earlier about finding a calm, quiet place is, for example, I live in the city and I'm right next to a window, and there's trucks that go by 24/7. So it's thinking about those types of distractions where I could easily shut the window. I'm very cognizant that, babies crying and dogs and cats and, for example, my laundry is going on right now. I'm not sure if you can hear it. Stuff like that happens. We're human.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions and we have about 10 or 15 minutes left. If you want to send a thank you email to everyone you met, but you don't have someone's email address, is there a way to get in touch with them?
Story of my life. Which is interesting because our applicant tracking system and sometimes the way I communicate with candidates won't show my direct email. So I would think if you don't have everyone's, I would contact your recruiter because you have that, or your contact at HR because you have that. I have no problem sending out all emails to a candidate saying these are the people you met with. here are their emails. If you don't feel comfortable reaching out to your recruiter, sometimes if you look on their website, there might, most of the time, if it's a partner or a manager or whatnot, they'll have their bio or LinkedIn profile or another way if going through your recruiter isn't comfortable for you, but hopefully it is.
Here's a question. Should you come out in an interview? I'd like to take that one. That's a really great question. And I think it depends. It depends on how much you know about the person you're interviewing with and the organization. I would say, is it relevant? And is it, why, I guess why, but if you also want to make sure that they are supportive of the LGBT community, potentially. But when I interview, so I am straight, but I don't talk about my personal life at all. I don't talk about my husband or refer to him as a partner, because I don't think it's relevant. But that's my decision, and that's the companies that I've interviewed with, the approach I take. Dana or Gary, do you have any experience or any suggestions for this person?
I think what you're twofold. One, what you're comfortable with. If like Colleen said, that's her approach. If that's your approach and that is important to you, then absolutely. But also too, like Colleen did mention, like I would also kind of read the interview, and if it comes up in an organic way, then you're comfortable, then that's okay.
Yeah, I think you make that decision after you get your answer or to the inclusion and diversity question, right? To kind of assess your comfort level at that point.
Okay, I think we have a couple more questions. What do you do if you are hired and the boss constantly uses the wrong pronouns and there's no HR department? First of all, I'm sorry if this is happening because it's wrong. And I think the first thing you need to do is confront the boss and just understand, what is the reasoning? Can you help me understand? You understand I use the pronouns she, her, hers, but you're using him, when you refer to me. Why is that? And I think it's okay to ask. This is a difficult situation, but I also, honestly, I would document it too. Because what if it gets to a point where you feel like you are being harassed, you are being discriminated? It's important that you have that documentation. If you feel at some point that you need to, bring it to the Mass Commission Against Discrimination and file a complaint. And I hope that doesn't happen, but not every place is a great place to work, and not every boss or manager is a good boss. Anything to add from the panel?
Spot on.
Good. We've got a few more. Okay, let's see if we can get to these last two. Regarding coming out in an interview, how can you correct someone misgendering you in an interview without it being perceived as disrespectful? So that's a great question. I think going back to the one we just talked about, if they're using the wrong pronouns, I would just gently correct them. I use she, her, hers.
Yeah, be direct.
Yeah. Let me see. I thought we had another question. Let me see.
I see one. When should you share that you will be on OPT or require sponsorship?
I mean, again, I think that's a hard question, just because some companies do sponsor and some don't. I would be upfront if you feel comfortable with it. It will come out just in terms of employment and paperwork and whatnot in your interview. So if whenever you feel comfortable, but a lot of the times that, at least I have that conversation in the first conversation, and that's something that I usually ask. It's on our application. Some companies do have it, some don't, so it could go both ways, but that's something that I usually discuss with candidates up front. So if you're comfortable with, disclosing that at the beginning, that is perfectly fine.
Hi, everyone. Carly again, Program and Ideation Director at the Chamber. Thank you to everyone who was on this webinar. It was so great. I also want to say that this webinar's focus was really around interview prep, the process of doing so. If you want to go to our upcoming programming, tomorrow we have a panel on presenting yourself authentically at work, and the panel will get more into the weeds of when do you come out? What do you do if you're asked an intrusive question? Speaking on personal experience of people on the panel who are cis, who are trans, who are not straight, generally, because it is important to have both the recruiter's perspective and the perspective of people who are actually job seeking. Just to speak to my own experience, I know the experience of others, as Colleen said, it can be used as an interview as a way to gauge if employers are LGBT friendly. There are other steps in interviews where I think, as Gary was saying, how an interview is a conversation to be able to advocate for yourself in that position and use it as a chance to kind of figure out, like, hey, you have an inclusion policy around this on your website, but I went through the interview process and there was only male and female as two options of a checkbox to apply. I see that you have an LGBT ERG, but how does that actually play out in the workplace? So that might be some ways to hint towards your identity if you don't want to fully come out, but you want to explore kind of what a company has available to feel things out that way. But yeah, so I want to say thank you to everyone. And if you still have questions that aren't answered for any reason, tune in to our webinar tomorrow, because I think we'll be getting in depth into a lot of these topics, especially around finding mentorship to use as a support system if there isn't somewhere in your corner in HR, thinking about ways to involve yourself and create an ERG or support network if there wasn't one already in place, which could be for the question, if you don't have HR, how do you address being misgendered? Yeah, so all of that and more is coming, and I will also be sharing some specific LGBT resources in our Facebook group as well. So yeah, for the panelists, again, thank you so much. And I wanted to say, if there's any parting words you would like to share for the last couple of minutes, otherwise we can give people 5 minutes of their day back for the end of this session.
I mean, I'll just say thank you for participating. If you're out of work right now, I'm sure it's pretty scary, but the job market is getting better. Companies are hiring. It just might be a little bit more difficult right now, but keep looking, use your network, definitely use your network. And just the fact that you showed up shows that you're trying to do the best you can to be prepared when that opportunity arises.
Yes, I echo Colleen. Thank you guys so much. If any advice I could give is literally just to be yourself. Like, those are, be genuine, like as Gary said, be genuine, be yourself, and you'll find the right fit. Absolutely.